I genuinely cannot tell if my eyebrows are super dark. I hope they look okay. Am I centered? Who cares? Hello party people, what's up? Welcome and welcome back to my channel. I'm Tori. Thank you so much for being here today. For today's video, I thought we would talk about books. More specifically, books that I would recommend if you're someone who has reading more books on their New Year's or January resolutions. I would still say I'm very much a casual reader. In 2022, I read 38 books, so not as extreme as some people, but definitely more than I was before. All of these books that I'm recommending are also books that I really loved this year. I can't tell if I'm crooked or not. But let's get into it. The first book I have in this stack that I would recommend is Assembly by Natasha Brown. I mean, look how tiny it is. I feel like it's like the least intimidating one in my little stack. Okay. Come of age in the credit crunch. Be civil in a hostile environment. Go to college, get an education, start a career. Do all the right things. Buy a flat, buy art, buy a sort of happiness, but above all, keep your head down. Keep quiet and keep going. The narrator of Assembly is a Black British woman. She's preparing to attend a lavish garden party at her boyfriend's family estate, set deep in the English countryside. At the same time, she's considering the carefully assembled pieces of herself. As the minutes tick down and the future beckons, she can't escape the question, is it time to take it all apart? Assembly is a story about the stories we live within, those of race and class, safety and freedom, winners and losers. And it is about one woman daring to take control of her own story, even at the cost of her life. As you can tell by the blurb, this book talks a lot about race and class and gender politic, and I just thought it was such a riveting read. This is definitely one of those books I would recommend because I felt myself thinking about this book long after I finished it. And I will say, like, I don't know if this intrigues you or puts you off from this book, but while I was reading, I did feel like some senses of claustrophobia because some of the things that our main character, that our narrator was saying or thinking to herself, I have felt that I have said to myself before. Even though I'm not a Black woman, I still feel like there are some similarities with the experience of being a woman of color. The story is also told in a very fragmented style, so I'd also keep that form in mind. But I feel like the form of this book and the fragmented element of it really kept me on my toes and also kind of turned on that part of my brain that was shut off ever since I stopped reading in school. But I feel like the spaces between the lines were just as important as the words on the page because they really forced you to kind of read in between the lines and kind of get in the mindset of the unnamed narrator. So I would definitely recommend Assembly. I'm gonna try and go in chronological order of when I read these. The next book that I have that I would highly recommend is The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. This book definitely had a lot of hype in 2021 and 2022, and I feel like I was kind of the last one to get on the hype train. The Vignay sisters will always be identical. But after growing up together in a small Southern Black community and running away at age 16, it's not just the shape of their daily lives that is different as adults, it's everything, including their racial identities. Many years later, one sister lives with her Black daughter in the same Southern town she once tried to escape. Across the country, the other secretly passes for white, and her white husband still knows nothing of her past. Still, although separated by so many miles and just as many lies, the fates of the twins remains intertwined. What will happen when their own daughters' storylines intersect, weaving together multiple strands and generations from the deep South to California? From the 1950s to the 1990s, The Vanishing Half is at once a riveting emotional family story and a brilliant exploration of race, gender, and identity, and the lasting influence of the past as it shapes a person's desires and expectation. Doesn't that sound delicious? As you can tell by the blurb, this talks a lot about race and class and identity and being a woman and trying to make your mark in the world. But I also really enjoyed this book because it kind of was me dipping my toes into generational stories. I've always been really afraid of diving into epic stories of generations and generations within a family because that just sounds so daunting to me. But reading that kind of story within this novel was super accessible. It kind of taught me that I would like to seek out more of those stories because I do enjoy that kind of intergenerational family dynamic. I know that it was also partly inspired by the book Passing. I mean, obviously it is a New York Times bestseller, so would definitely recommend The Vanishing Half. The next recommendation I have is actually an author, not just a book, and that author is Melissa Broder. In 2022, I read 2 of Melissa Broder's novels. I read The Pisces and I read Milk Fed. I originally read The Pisces for a book club and I enjoyed it so much that I picked up Milk Fed. And I feel like these books, if you can stomach the content warnings of them, they are truly unputdownable. I think I read both of these in like the span of a week, and for me as a casual reader, that is so quick. Like I literally could not get these books out of my head. Like when I was working or when I was like out to dinner with friends, I was like, I just want to go home so I can read this book and finish this book. I would also say these books were also kind of my introduction into magical realism, especially The Pisces. I tried to read Murakami's Norwegian Wood in 2021 and I literally got 3/4 of the way through and I was like, I'll finish this eventually. Haven't picked it up since. Honestly, both of these were such a romp. The first book of Melissa Broder's that I read is The Pisces, and as you can tell from the cover, a woman falls in love with a fish. Lucy has been writing her dissertation on Sappho for 9 years when she and her boyfriend break up in a dramatic flame out. After she bottoms out in Phoenix, her sister in Los Angeles insists Lucy dog sit for the summer in her gorgeous Venice Beach home. And when Lucy becomes entranced by an eerily attractive swimmer while sitting alone on the beach one night, her life, including her understanding of what love should look like, takes a very unexpected turn. A masterful blend of vivid realism and giddy fantasy, pairing hilarious frankness with pulse-racing eroticism, The Pisces is a story about falling in obsessive love with a merman, a figure of sirenic fantasy whose very existence pushes Lucy to question everything she thought she knew about love, lust, and the meaning in the one life we have. I also read this with a book club of mine. One thing our little collective thought was very interesting was like the takeaways one would have, whether you believe that Lucy actually fell in love with a merman or whether you thought the merman was a figment of her imagination. That is The Pisces. And then this is Milk Fed. I would highly recommend you check out the trigger warnings for Milk Fed because a lot of this book does center around disordered eating. So if that is something that upsets you, take this recommendation with a grain of salt. Rachel is a 24-year-old lapsed Jew who has made calorie restriction her religion. Working as an underling at a Los Angeles talent management agency, she maintains an illusion of existential control by way of obsessive food rituals. Rachel is content to carry on subsisting until her therapist encourages her to take a communication detox from her mother, who raised her in the tradition of calorie counting. Rachel soon meets Miriam, a zaftig young Orthodox Jewish woman who works at her favorite frozen yogurt shop. Rachel is suddenly and powerfully entranced by Miriam, by her Sundays and her body, her faith and her family, and as the two grow closer, Rachel embarks on a journey marked by mirrors, mysticism, mothers, milk, and honey. Pairing superlative emotional insight with unabashed vivid fantasy, Broder tells a tale of appetites, physical hunger, sexual desire, spiritual longing, and the ways that we try to compartmentalize these so often interdependent instincts. Milk Fed is a tender and darkly hilarious meditation on love, certitude, and the question of what we are all being fed, from one of our major writers on the psyche, both sacred and profane. I honestly think that if you are someone who loves to read about like feminine hunger and desire and read about it so unabashedly and almost like not entirely grotesque, but like maybe a little bit gross in the way that we don't normally read about women's desire in like the fiction we read in school, I would highly recommend Melissa Broder. Like these blurbs say, I do truly think she's very darkly hilarious. I would also say if you're someone who has been reading literature that takes place in Los Angeles, whether that's Joan Didion or Eve Babbitt's, if you are a fan of Eve Babbitt's, you would definitely be a fan of the humor in Melissa Broder's books. So that's Melissa Broder. The next book that I have to recommend is Writers and Lovers by Lily King. Again, this is one of those books that I think is unputdownable. One thing that I noticed, or actually that was pointed out to me over the course of 2022, was that I had read a lot of books about writers. Like in The Pisces, there was Lucy, who was a woman writing her dissertation. I also read a lot of romances literally set around writers. I read Book Lovers by Emily Henry, which I honestly did not enjoy as much as I enjoyed her other books. I found one of my new favorite romances, Funny You Should Ask, which was centered around a writer. I read Sex and Rage by Eve Babbitt's that was centered around a writer. I read a lot of Eve Babbitt's and she talked a lot about her process as a writer. I read a lot of books about writers, and this one right here is honestly one of my favorites. Blindsided by her mother's sudden death and wrecked by a recent love affair, 31-year-old Casey Peabody has arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the summer of 1997 without a plan beyond a determination to live a creative life. Written with King's trademark humor, heart, and intelligence, this is a transfixing novel that explores artistic passion, ambition, and the terrifying and exhilarating leap between the end of one phase of life and the beginning of another. Writers and Lovers is an unforgettable portrait of an artist as a young woman. I also think this book really set the stage for me for my other two favorites, which center around passion and ambition and just being in the head of like an artist. One thing I really enjoyed about Writers and Lovers is that it felt like a coming of age story, and it very much is a coming of age story, but in popular media, whether that's television, whether that's film or books, oftentimes coming of age happens when you're 17 and 18, but this one happens to Casey when she's in her early 30s. I also like the way Lily King showed us how intelligent Casey is as a character. Like, the literary references that Casey would make like in her head make sense for the kind of writer and person that Casey is. And I also really enjoyed the conversations about grief in this book. I feel like after I read this book, I was like, I need to value the relationship that I have with my living mother, because I was just so sad for Casey. I would say though, the first like 70 pages of this book were kind of hard for me to get into because it was kind of setting the scene for what Casey's life is like. But once you get into it, the story flies. So I would definitely recommend Writers and Lovers by Lily King. So these next two books put me in major reading slumps, and I only got out of one reading slump because I had found the other book. If you don't know, a reading slump is just a period of time where you don't pick up a book, and that can be caused by two things. It can be caused by reading a book that was so atrocious and awful that you're like, I don't want to pick up another book again and waste my time, or because you read a book that was so phenomenal, you're like, why should I even pick up a book again? No book will ever compare. The latter is what happened with these two books, and honestly I'm still trying to fight my way out of a reading slump from one of them. The first one is Sirens and Muses by Antonia Angress. Oh, this book, first of all, cover is literally stunning. Four artists are drawn into a web of rivalry and desire at an elite art school and on the streets of New York in this magnificent debut for fans of Writers and Lovers and The Goldfinch. It's 2011. America is in a deep recession and Occupy Wall Street is escalating. But at the elite Rin College of Art, students paint and sculpt in a rarefied bubble. Louisa Arsenault is a thoughtful, observant 19-year-old when she transfers to Rin as a scholarship student, but she soon finds herself adrift in an environment that prizes novelty over beauty. Complicating matters is Louisa's unexpected attraction to her charismatic roommate, Karina Pointek, the preternaturally, I don't read aloud a lot, gifted but mercurial daughter of a wealthy art collector. Gradually, Louisa and Karina are drawn into an intense, sensual, and artistic relationship, one that forces them to confront their deepest desires and fears. But Karina also can't shake her fascination with Preston Utley, a senior and anti-capitalist internet provocateur who is publicly feuding with visiting professor and political painter Robert Berger, a once controversial figurehead seeking to regain relevance. When Preston concocts an explosive hoax, the fate of all four artists are upended as each is unexpectedly thrust into the cutthroat New York art world. Now all must struggle to find new identities in art, in society, and among each other. In the process, they have to either discover their most authentic terms of life, of success, failure, and joy, or risk losing themselves altogether. With a canny, critical eye, Sirens and Muses overturns notions of class, money, art, youth, and a generation's fight to their own future. I could not stop thinking about this book for literally months after I finished reading it. I am trying to convince my brother, who is someone who works in the art world, to read this book because it was so interesting. I also really enjoyed this book because you get to follow each of the characters from their own perspective. So it'll always flip-flop from like Louisa to Karina to Preston to Robert, and you kind of get to see like their own opinions and their own sides to the situations that they all kind of find themselves intertangled and intermixed in. And it was so good. It was so enthralling. I also really love this book because it asked a lot of questions about art and like specifically like the intersections of art and consumerism and art and the internet, and like, is something considered art even though it's monetized? Is the internet actually a tool for democratizing art, or are we just saying that it is? This is another one that also really very much reads like a movie if you are someone who just wants to be entertained, but you want to be entertained, but you want to have like more like thought-provoking entertainment. The last book I want to share with you all is one that is so popular. It was literally, I think, like one of the top books of 2022, and because of all that hype, I was so nervous to read this book, but I read it, I loved it, and now I'm contributing to the hype, and that is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. Oh, again, another stunning cover. Like, can you believe? Like, this looks so good on my shelf. After finishing this book, I wanted to restart it and read it because I had been zooming through this book. Again, up and downable, reads like a movie. I was like, I just want to know how the story ends. I love these characters, Sam and Sadie, so much. Like, I just want to know what happens. This is also another pick from my book club. We had amazing picks in my book club this year. I would also recommend this for people who have like big book fear because this is just shy of like 400 pages. Yeah, it's literally 397 pages. So if you are someone who kind of has like a bit of a big book fear, would definitely recommend this book. I also would recommend this book to you if you are someone who wants to dip their toes into like a sprawling story that takes place over decades and decades. Similarly to how I feel about stories that talk about multiple generations of a family, I also was afraid of like books that kind of span like decades. I believe this one spans about like 2 decades. On a bitter cold day in the December of his junior year at Harvard, Sam Mauser exits a subway car and sees, amid the hordes of people waiting on the platform, Sadie Green. He calls her name. For a moment, she pretends she hasn't heard him, but then she turns and a game begins. A legendary collaboration that will launch them to stardom. These friends, intimates since childhood, borrow money, beg favors, and before even graduating college, they have created their first blockbuster, Ichigo. Overnight, the world is theirs. Not even 25 years old, Sam and Sadie are brilliant, successful, and rich, but these qualities won't protect them from their own creative ambitions or the betrayals of their hearts. Spanning 30 years, from Cambridge, Massachusetts to Venice Beach, California, and lands in between and far beyond, Gabrielle Zevin's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is a dazzling and intricately imagined novel that examines the multifarious nature of identity, disability, failure, and the redemptive possibilities in play, and above all, our need to connect, to be loved and to love. Yes, it is a love story, but it's not one you have read before. I would definitely say I am not a gamer girly in any sense of the word, but I did really enjoy like the book Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, so I did feel like I was kind of primed to enjoy this as well. It talks a lot about ambition and like this newfound desire to be immortalized. I have felt that in my own personal life, and I also loved reading about that in Sirens and Muses as well, so I was really primed to like this book. I feel like a lot of artists can relate to Sam and Sadie in this book. You also get to see the different situations from Sam and Sadie's perspective, and this also kind of jumps time a little bit. For example, there'll be parts when like you are either in the point of view of Sam or Sadie and they're building one of their games, and then it'll interject with like an in-universe interview of them talking about this game like decades on. Yeah, that's Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. I literally don't know what I can say that people have not said before. Okay, I'm looking at this stack and I'm trying to think about any other books that I would recommend. The only thing that I can actually think of is, lastly, say if you are someone who wants to get into reading audiobooks or listening to audiobooks, I would highly recommend you start by listening to memoirs, because more often than not, the person that the memoir is about is the one narrating it. And the two that I really enjoyed this year are I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy and Yearbook by Seth Rogen. I feel like especially celebrity memoirs, they're so fun to listen to on audiobook because it just sounds like your friend is telling you like a story or just gossiping to you. And so now I do have an affinity for Jeanette McCurdy and Seth Rogen because I feel like we're besties. I know myself now, and I know that I never want to like purchase a physical copy of a memoir if I can listen to it in an audiobook form, because that just feels like more fun to me. So yes, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. If you decide to pick up any of these books, please let me know what you think. If you've read any of these books, let me know your thoughts on any of these. If you want to see more of me, feel free to follow me on Instagram or TikTok. And if you want to know what I'm reading, feel free to follow me on Storygraph. It'll all be linked down below. And I'll see you for the next one. Bye.